A beloved daughter vanishes quietly from her home.
Her bedroom was empty.
Her bed had not been slept in.
She wasn't answering her phone.
Who's there?
She was a very responsible young lady. They were concerned.
But just as the search begins, an unexpected 911 call brings it to a sudden halt.
The girl been hurt at my house.
He went to check the shed, and he saw a large storage bin that hadn't been there before.
Could you send somebody, please, quick?
Had her generous heart led her into danger?
She tried her best to support him.
She thought she could be a friend to him.
She was convinced he was a good person.
Or is the mind behind her murder far more troubled than anyone imagined?
He just kept repeating over and over, "Ma, I f***ed up."
He had rage in him.
I would have never thought, man. But I guess when you're having mental issues and stuff like that, man, I don't know.
He went off his medication.
It's just been like a struggle with him saying, "I want to be normal, I'm not normal."
He kept telling the detectives that he was hearing voices.
He's not mentally stable.
August 31st, 2018. It's early Friday morning in Atlanta, Georgia, and this sprawling metropolis of over 6 million is already on the move.
There's something in Atlanta for everybody. It's a really interesting city.
A lot of people just know the name Atlanta, but Atlanta Metro is a lot of small towns on the outskirts where these subdivisions and homes are opening up, a lot of opportunity. It's a lot going on here.
And this morning, in one of the city's western suburbs, a local nurse is arriving at the home of her patient, Shara Chapman, to begin her shift.
Ooh, sorry I'm late. Traffic was awful today.
Shara's confined to a wheelchair after suffering a series of strokes.
She couldn't really do for herself the way a typical person would, and so she had a day nurse.
At night, Shara's 17-year-old daughter, India, looks after her.
Usually, India is there to greet the nurse, kind of inform her of what happened the night before so that she's prepared to do whatever needs to be done for Shara throughout the day.
But that morning, India wasn't waiting when the nurse got in.
The nurse went back to India's room to see if she was asleep still.
India? Mom have a rough night? India?
India was gone.
India Chapman had always had a compassionate heart.
India had a reputation for being this extremely caring, loving young lady, even to strangers and people that she didn't even know.
She really did care about you. She was a happy person.
But she was also no stranger to tragedy.
India was only 5 years old when her mom was diagnosed with sarcoidosis of the brain after a series of debilitating strokes.
I had to take her and her siblings to come live with me. But she loved her mom and wanted to be with her mom.
Despite what we went through, she was always brave, and I really love that about her.
As a teenager, India wanted to help however she could.
India decided that she was going to move back in with her mom and help to take care of her.
India was so committed to her mother that the caretaker would come during the day and India would be her caretaker at night.
The level of maturity that she had at that age is not found very often.
The experience pointed her toward a career in healthcare.
Her seeing my mom not being able to take care of herself motivated her to want to be a nurse.
To jumpstart her career, India enrolled in the GED program at Atlanta Technical College.
Her plan was to get her GED and then continue on to get a nursing certification.
She was already taking care of her mother, and so she wanted to make sure she got the certifications to properly do that for her mom as well as other people.
They loved her at Atlanta Tech. I mean, they called her their child. They loved her, and she would make them laugh a lot.
But a promising nursing career wasn't the only thing on India's horizon.
In 2017, India started dating a young man named Sincere Brown.
She knew of him in high school, but they never had any dealings. Then she ended up seeing him at Atlanta Tech.
Sincere was quiet, a bit of a loner.
He had mental health issues.
Sincere, right?
Yeah.
Mind if I sit with you?
Sure, you can sit.
I think that she saw a need that he had, and she wanted to be there for him.
She felt that he was misunderstood. She thought she could help him in whatever he was going through.
But India was willing to take a chance on Sincere.
They liked each other. They spent a lot of time together.
It looked like a teenage fling. Boy meets girl, girl meets boy. They're happy, they're in love. They're just enjoying it.
And it appeared that their teenage romance had a future.
India and Sincere's relationship progressed to the point where Sincere gave India a promise ring.
That was a turning point for them. The relationship got deeper. It got more serious.
With a budding romance and an exciting career taking shape, India had everything to look forward to.
I'm not gonna lie, I was jealous.
But now, she's mysteriously disappeared.
When the nurse got there, India didn't come to the door.
And she wasn't in her room.
The bed was still made.
So she checks with India's younger brother.
But he didn't know where India was either.
Let me see where she's at.
He texted her and she didn't text back.
Weird. She always responds right away.
They immediately became concerned and they started calling her phone.
But the result is the same.
Hi, it's India. Leave a message.
You're not getting her?
She wasn't responding to anybody's calls.
That sent up a lot of red flags.
Hi, it's India. Leave a message.
17-year-old India Chapman was taking GED classes during the day while caring for her ailing mother at night.
Her mother had been diagnosed with sarcoidosis, so she was wheelchair-bound, and India, as she became older, she really became her mother's care provider.
She had to grow up quicker than she normally would have.
But even with all the responsibility, India had found the time to start a relationship with 18-year-old Sincere Brown.
Sincere was something of a loner who'd sometimes been bullied when he and India were in high school.
She felt that she could take care of him or help him get through whatever he needed to get through.
Maybe it was her being this forever caretaker and him needing to be taken care of. Maybe that's what drew them together.
But now she's mysteriously disappeared.
When her mother's nurse had arrived at the house that morning, there was no sign of India.
This was not her normal behavior, to not be at the residence that early in the morning.
Her brother, he texted her and she didn't text back.
Leave a message.
She wasn't answering her phone.
She was a very responsible young lady, so they were concerned.
And as word that she's missing spreads, various members of her family try to reach her.
I was at work. I was in my classroom teaching, but something just told me call her phone. I called it 3 times and each time someone answered.
India, is that you?
But that wasn't the strangest part.
Every time that they would call her phone, somebody would call back immediately, but they never said anything.
Hello? Who is this?
The calls came from an unknown number.
I told them, I know you have her phone, but they wouldn't say anything.
There's no way to know who's on the other end of the line, but India's grandmother has an idea of who it might be.
After India met Sincere, it wasn't too long into their relationship where she started seeing some anger issues with Sincere.
I remember a time he was fussing with India, and he took her phone and threw it.
One minute he was fine, the next minute he's raging, and then he's fine again.
She's also aware of past allegations of behavioral issues.
Me being in the school system for over 27 years, you hear things. From my understanding of what teachers and counselors that I know was telling me, he would overturn tables. He would have fits in the classroom.
But it wasn't until Sincere gave India the promise ring that her grandmother saw just how out of control Sincere could become.
The ring was too big for her finger, so he wanted to go to get the ring sized. So I took them.
And on the drive, India's grandmother was alarmed by his behavior.
Sincere just began to be very irate.
He started going off on India.
He was berating her, yelling and screaming.
He kind of catches the grandmother off guard.
But only for a moment.
I told him, "You're not gonna act that way in my car." And he kicked my seat. And I stopped the car in the middle of the street to let him know, "I'll put you out of my car right now." And he said, "India, go with me."
Come on, let's go.
I told him, "No, India won't go anywhere, but you'll get out of my car. So you need to pipe yourself down." And he calmed himself down.
I'm sorry.
His behavior switched instantly almost, and he began to apologize, trying to convince India that everything was okay, that he didn't mean it.
And Sincere's apologies were enough for India.
Because she was so committed to him and their relationship, she stuck it out because she thought she would be able to help.
But her grandmother urged her to end the relationship.
He had rage in him, and I didn't think she should have been around him anymore.
Eventually, India had come to agree with her grandmother.
India came to the realization that it was probably best for her to end the relationship with Sincere, and she made the decision to do so.
Nobody wants to keep getting hurt again and again and again, like it's draining.
But she didn't entirely cut Sincere out of her life.
We still see India's heart, her compassion kind of surfacing with her desire to keep the communications line open, with her desires to not close the door completely, and I think it's a testament ultimately to just the kind of person she is.
She thought she could still be a friend to him.
And it appeared that India's instincts were correct.
They just went their own separate ways. Everything seemed fine. It seemed like it was a clean breakup. They remained friends even after the breakup.
But now that India has disappeared, is it possible that Sincere is involved?
He seemed like the type. He'll either hurt you real bad or kill you.
While India's loved ones continue to search for her, across town, another worried grandparent has just called police.
911, what's the emergency?
DeKalb County Police Department gets a 911 call from an older gentleman urging them to come over to his house.
You just need to send the police to my house, please.
He said his daughter had told him some alarming news about his grandson.
My grandson told her that he had hurt the girl.
He states that they need someone to come over immediately.
Okay, and where's the girl?
The girl is in my shed.
As the family of 17-year-old nursing student India Chapman desperately search for any clues to her whereabouts, DeKalb County 911 receives a call that could change everything.
911, what's the emergency?
The girl been hurt at my house, man. So you just need to send the police to my house, please.
The police department isn't really clear on what the gentleman means by hurt and to what degree.
I didn't come home last night, so he must have snuck the girl in my house or something.
When they asked the caller what happened, he said he wasn't exactly sure because he hadn't actually spoken to his grandson.
My daughter called me this morning and told me she wanted to talk to me. So I went and met her, that's what she told me.
He says his daughter doesn't know exactly what happened either, but she did know where the girl was.
He shares with police dispatch that the girl is in his shed.
Did you go in the shed and check on her?
Yes.
He says he looked in the shed and there was a storage bin in there that didn't belong.
I didn't want to mess with it.
He immediately called them because he just didn't know what to do.
Could you send somebody, please, quick?
When officers arrive, the man immediately takes them to his backyard.
They go back to the shed, and there's a bin there with a comforter hanging out the top.
They notice several large bloodstains on it.
And what they find inside confirms what the caller's daughter told him.
They clearly see that they have a deceased individual. So this location has become a crime scene.
The officers secure the scene and alert homicide detectives.
When the detectives arrived and examined the body, they immediately saw that the victim was a young Black woman covered in a large amount of blood.
They were able to observe the early signs of rigor mortis.
Rigor mortis is the stiffening of muscle fibers in a dead person's body, usually sets in 2 to 6 hours after death.
That let them know about what time frame that this crime actually took place.
After the medical examiner and CSI take over the scene at the shed, detectives turn their attention to the residence.
In the upstairs hallway, detectives find some blood on the floor and on the door leading to the bedroom.
As they enter, they see blood on the floor and they notice that the sheets are missing off the bed.
And in the laundry room, they find a set of sheets and men's clothing.
The clothes and the sheets were still in the washing machine, waiting to be put into the dryer.
Somebody that's attempting to clean up a crime scene.
So detectives speak to the 911 caller, hoping to find out more about his grandson.
He tells them that he had been staying with him the last few months.
And his grandson's name is Sincere Brown.
His daughter had asked him to take Sincere in because he couldn't live with her anymore.
He got in some trouble, man, over there where his mama lived at, right?
He had been struggling with some behavioral issues. He had gotten into some legal situations while staying with his mom.
He had committed a crime at her residence and he was no longer allowed to live there.
He had stolen a neighbor's cell phone.
But before he came here, he was staying over the little girl house named India.
However, he says that India's family had quickly kicked him out.
He couldn't stay with her no more. So I let him come over here and stay with me.
But even with him living with his grandfather, Sincere kept getting into trouble.
He stole my car.
Sincere's grandfather said he hadn't reported the theft.
I didn't want to get in trouble.
But he told Sincere's parents that he'd had enough.
I said, y'all got to come get him because I can't deal with this. At my age right now, I don't have time for that because I can't watch him like that. So they said, okay, we're going to come get him this week. We're going to put him somewhere where he can get some help and all of that, right? I said, okay, so I'm going to just let him stay for a couple of days.
Sincere's checkered past is a red flag for detectives. But what they really want to know is what happened at the house the night before.
I don't know, man.
Sincere's grandfather said they had been hanging out together watching a tennis match, and afterward, he left the house at around 11 o'clock.
I didn't come back home. I stayed out all night.
Which meant Sincere was in the house, alone. Or so he thought.
My daughter called me early this morning, about 7 o'clock. She said, I need to talk to you.
She asked him to meet her at a nearby gas station.
When he gets to the gas station, he sees his daughter, but he also sees Sincere sitting on the curb.
He got into his daughter's car, and they began to have a conversation. And he says to police officers that what she told him just left him speechless. He couldn't believe it.
What did she tell you?
She told me that he told her that he had hurt India.
She kept saying that Sincere had hurt India and then put her in his shed. He didn't quite understand what that meant, so he kept pressing her, but she just kept saying the same thing again.
He tells his daughter, the only thing that we can do is that we have to notify the police.
I just kind of panicked. I said, come on, let's go back to my house. Let's call the police so we can get this straight. To put him in the car and take him with you.
But something happened on the way to the house.
They was following me till we got to Western Chapel, and I looked in my mirror, I said, damn.
Out of nowhere, he sees his daughter stop the car.
And then all of a sudden, Sincere jumps out.
He jumped out of the car and ran.
Sincere Brown's grandfather has just told detectives in DeKalb County, Georgia, that the 18-year-old confessed that he'd hurt his girlfriend, India Chapman.
Did he say what he did to her?
No, I don't know. They never did get to that part, man, about how he did it or nothing like that.
He had just kept saying that he messed up. He messed up.
But as his mother was driving him to his grandfather's, Sincere had bailed.
He was in the car and he jumped out.
And since then, neither he nor Sincere's mother had been able to reach him.
He called him, his daughter called him. Nobody could get him to answer the phone. They didn't know where he was.
But his grandfather says Sincere couldn't have gone far.
He ain't got no money. He ain't got nowhere to go.
Sincere's grandfather says that after his grandson made a run for it, they returned home without him.
She followed you over here?
Yeah, she followed me.
Did she go back there?
No, she couldn't take it. She ain't been back there yet.
The grandfather went to check the shed, and when he did, he saw a large storage bin that hadn't been there before. And inside, he could see a comforter from Sincere's room.
That's when he knew his grandson had done something terrible.
I just broke down and cried. Why would you hurt that girl, man? Why?
He just could not wrap his mind around what would make his grandson commit such a deadly crime.
I don't understand, man. But I guess when you're having mental issues and stuff like that, I don't know.
He had some issues that he had been dealing with since he was a child.
He had little mental episodes, man. I can remember when he was a kid going to school, man. My daughter used to call me. I used to have to go out there every day, man. I couldn't even work. I used to go out there and had to go get him because he was disruptive in class.
He also says that his grandson had been prescribed medication to control his outbursts.
He was on, whatever they get them kids and all that kind of stuff, man.
Although he says as Sincere got older, he'd stopped taking it.
It make his stomach hurt or something like that.
After Sincere went off his medication, it was increasingly hard for his mother to handle him and control his behavior.
She was doing everything she could to try to maintain, keep him with some kind of stability in his life, but it just wasn't working.
It was becoming overwhelming for her, so he wanted to step in and help, but now it was too much for him too.
The seriousness of what's wrong with him, I don't know that. I just know that he couldn't hold down no job, and when she called me this morning and told me that, man, the disbelief, man, I couldn't believe what she had told me.
He was just in shock over what had happened.
Oh, man, her grandmama and all of them, man, they love that girl so much, man. I can't believe this.
Has anybody been in contact with India's parents?
No, I don't know her numbers or nothing like that. I don't know. Okay. But I know where she lived at.
As officers begin searching for Sincere, detectives head straight to Atlanta's west side to speak with India's mother.
Death notifications are always very challenging for detectives. It's never easy when you have to tell a family member that their loved one is deceased, whether it's an accident or, in this case, a murder.
As soon as she gets the tragic news, she contacts India's grandmother.
Shara called me and said, Mama, and I'm in class. She said, India dead. It didn't grab my attention right away. I said, I'll call you back. And once I hung the phone up, it dawned on me what she said. my daughter said, and I told the other teacher that was in the classroom, I need to step out the classroom. And I stepped in the hall, and I called my daughter back, and I said, Charlotte, what did you say? She said, India's dead. She said the detectives just came to her house and told her that they found her dead.
The news is simply too devastating for India's grandmother to process.
I was numb. I couldn't cry at the time because I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
While India's family grieves, the detectives get to work, starting by speaking with Sincere's mother.
She starts by saying that Sincere had called her that morning, saying that he had messed up.
I'm like, Sincere, what is wrong? You need to tell me what's wrong. He kept saying that he didn't want to tell me right now. He just want to ride.
Sincere's mother explained that in the past, when he was having problems, she would drive him around and talk to him about whatever it was that was upsetting him.
But she says when she met with him that morning, she could tell this time was different.
Like, he literally stands there and he starts crying.
He tells his mom, I did something very bad.
He kept saying, I think I hurt somebody.
According to his family, 18-year-old Sincere Brown all but confessed that he had killed his ex-girlfriend, India Chapman.
He kept saying, I think I hurt somebody.
And now his mother is desperate for the police to find him.
I don't want nothing to happen to him, and I don't want him to hurt someone, because I know he's impulsive.
He used to get into trouble at school constantly, and he'd have these episodes of raging and anger.
She spoke about him punching holes in the wall, throwing things in the pool at the apartment complex. He had stole her rent money. He stole the grandfather's vehicle.
I've been dealing with this his whole life. The temper tantrums, the impulsive behavior.
For years, she had been dealing with these issues with her son, and she didn't know what to do. He had been diagnosed very early with some serious mental health issues.
It was 2 or 3 things in his psychological evaluation.
He actually had been put on medication, and by the age of 15, he made the decision that he was no longer going to take the medication. He said he didn't like how it made him feel.
I went to the courts and tried to get him court order, and that's when I learned you can't court order someone to take medications. Since then, it's just been like a struggle with him saying, I want to be normal, I'm not normal. And this has been going on over the last 3 years.
She had gone through so much with this young man through her life. I think she was almost at her wit's end, but it was that motherly instinct to keep trying.
I've reached out for help, and I've cried out for help and went to different organizations to try to get him medicated, to try to get him counseling.
Sincere's mom, she had to be more than mom. She had to be advocate for him. She had to be a protector for him. And this is not something that would just remain in his childhood. This would go on into his adulthood.
And when Sincere started dating India, she thought it would be good for him.
I mean, she tried her best to support him in whatever way she could.
But the relationship was far from perfect.
Sincere would be mean to her, and, you know, I would try to diffuse the situation, but they've always had an up and down rocky relationship.
Have they ever been violent with each other?
Yeah.
They have?
Sincere's mother attempted to encourage India to walk away from the relationship because she had seen for years how troubled her son was. And she had witnessed violent episodes that her son, Sincere, was exhibiting towards India.
And she admits she can no longer save Sincere from himself.
Do you believe in your heart of all hearts that your son killed this girl?
I do.
Okay.
And I'm telling you, with a straight face, no holds barred, looking you dead in your eye, yes, I do. I mean, the things he did last year, I could fix it. I can't fix this. I can't fix it.
Nobody can fix what Sincere did, but he can be held accountable. And the reckoning won't take long.
Soon after the detectives finish talking to Sincere's mom, they receive word that he's ready to turn himself in.
But while Sincere surrenders without incident, he's not exactly cooperative when the detectives sit him down for an interview.
Here to help you in any way we can, okay? But in order to do that, you got to be willing to talk to us, okay? I can't hear you, man.
He was attempting to cover his head with his shirt, lay his head on the table, and he kept yawning continuously.
Okay, why don't you tell me your address? Where you staying?
He really couldn't answer their questions.
He's saying, I don't remember, I don't know where I live, I don't know this, I don't know that.
Sincere, you need to be looking at me, not down the table.
He just seemed distracted.
And according to Sincere, there's a reason for that.
You don't feel good? What feels wrong?
He kept saying repeatedly, I keep hearing voices in my head. He's not mentally stable.
After his arrest for the murder of India Chapman, 18-year-old Sincere Brown has offered detectives a surprising explanation for why he isn't answering their questions.
He kept telling the detectives that he was hearing voices.
You keep hearing stuff? Okay. Is there anything I can do to help you out with that?
You really have to be trained to get answers when somebody has the kind of mental health issues that Sincere had. But the detectives, they didn't know how to ask the right questions for somebody that has mental health issues.
And it's clear that the detectives become more and more frustrated as the interview goes on.
Sincere, look at me. If you don't want to talk to me, at least have enough respect for yourself and for me to say, I don't want to talk to you, okay? I don't want to talk to you.
He told him he didn't want to do the interview, and the interview was ceased.
With Sincere refusing to cooperate, the detectives were forced to use other methods to try to piece together just how India died.
The first piece of the puzzle is the autopsy.
The detectives received the autopsy report, and they learned that India had stab wounds.
He stabbed her 8 times. He stabbed her in the neck at her jugular, and she bled to death.
In further conversations with India's family, her grandmother provides the detectives with a possible motive.
She had moved on. She was seeing another guy, and I think Sincere found out about it and didn't like it.
And when they subpoena India's cell phone records, they discover a flurry of communication just prior to the murder.
Detectives surmised that Sincere had lured India to the residence with the intention to kill her.
I just need to talk to you. Please, please. Just for a little while, please.
Keeping the line of communication open with Sincere definitely made India a lot more vulnerable.
She knew something wasn't right, but I don't think she felt endangered.
But she may not have realized just how desperate Sincere had become.
Sincere may have felt he was losing touch with her.
She's about to go see other successful people her age that's into the careers and things that she's into.
And she was already seeing someone new.
That's a further loss of control that could push someone to do something.
The police believe that once India arrived at Sincere's grandfather's house, an argument ensued, most likely about India's new boyfriend.
Why him? Why not me?
It's no use talking about this.
And rebuffed by India, Sincere had lost his temper and turned violent.
It was clear that he was absolutely in a state of rage.
8 stabbings, 1 here to the neck. That's saying, if I can't have you, no one else can.
Then he tried to conceal what he'd done.
Sincere wrapped her body in the comforter and hid her in his grandfather's shed.
But the guilt was too much for him. So he turned to the one person who'd always been there to protect him.
He'd reached out to his mother.
The evidence is more than enough for murder charges.
In November of 2018, the prosecutors take the case to the grand jury, who indict Sincere on charges of felony murder, aggravated assault, and concealing a death.
I had to pray real hard for God not to let me hate him, so he could not have the power over me or take me to a dark place that I couldn't come out of.
Charging Sincere is one thing, but convicting him is another. Given the circumstances, though, the prosecutors are hopeful.
He certainly can't use a psychotic break for an excuse, because the cleaning up of the crime scene, the washing of his clothes and the sheets, and moving the body from the house to a back shed, all of those activities are somebody that is very well aware of what they're doing.
He showed many examples of whether he knew right from wrong.
Including, at least to some, Sincere's interview with the police after his arrest.
The only thing he can think of was, I'm just gonna act like some crazy voices in my head told me to do this. That's what I got from Sincere's interviews.
But in the end, there's no need to convince a jury of Sincere's sanity.
He chose to take a plea deal.
My daughter and I had to meet with the lawyers to see if we would accept it or did we want to go to trial. And I wanted this to be over. So, we took the plea deal.
A trial can be very traumatic, especially for a family. Just looking at the pictures, hearing details, I wouldn't want to do it.
In July of 2022, Sincere pleads guilty to murder.
He was sentenced to 30 years for murder and 5 years for concealment of a body.
He had to serve 25 of the years, 10 on probation.
But that hardly seems like enough for India's family.
I felt he should have gotten more time because he knew what he was going to do. He knew it.
This is such a sad story because this young lady was 17 years old. He was 18 years old. Both of them should have been in the prime of their lives. And she's in a grave and he's in prison. And you still have two families that are suffering.
All I could think about, what was in my baby's mind, was she pleading for her life. And I'm sure she did. But he didn't care.
This young man doesn't have full control of himself or his emotions because he's not stable.
And unfortunately, India never truly realized that until it was too late.
When you see a sign of violence in anyone that you're dating, do not attempt to change anybody. Just get out of the relationship.
Please get out before it's too late. Let a family member know. They will be there for you. You just have to speak. You have a voice, use it.
Just say something to somebody. I know you want to protect people, but you have to protect yourself.
There are murders that are solved within days, and there are murders that remain unanswered for years. But the case of Sherry Rasmussen belongs to a more unsettling category. A murder in which the person eventually convicted was not a stranger hiding somewhere beyond the reach of investigators, but a police officer who continued her career inside the very institution responsible for investigating the crime. On February 24, 1986, 29-year-old Sherry Ray Rasmussen was found dead inside her townhouse in Van Nuys, Los Angeles. She had been severely beaten and shot 3 times in the chest. There was evidence that she had fought with her attacker, including a bite wound on her arm. At the time, investigators believed the killing was connected to a burglary. The theory was that intruders had entered the home, encountered Sherry, and killed her. It was a theory that would shape the investigation for years. But there was another person connected to Sherry's life. Someone who had a very different reason to be present in the story. Her name was Stephanie Eileen Lazarus. In 1986, Lazarus was approximately 26 years old and had already been a Los Angeles Police Department officer for about 2 years. She was not an obvious outsider. She was part of law enforcement. She understood police work, understood investigations, and belonged to the institution that would eventually investigate Sherry's death. More importantly, Lazarus had a personal connection to Sherry's husband, John Rudin. Before John married Sherry, he had been romantically involved with Lazarus for several years. Eventually, John fell in love with Sherry and moved toward marriage. By late 1985, Sherry and John were married. Their marriage had only begun a few months before Sherry's death. According to the prosecution's later presentation, Lazarus remained deeply affected by the relationship ending and by John's decision to marry Sherry. Evidence presented at trial included a letter Lazarus had written to John's mother, material that prosecutors used to demonstrate the depth of her continuing emotional attachment to John. There was also another important detail. Before Sherry was killed, Lazarus had confronted her at Sherry's workplace. In retrospect, these facts formed a troubling pattern. Lazarus had once been romantically connected to John. John had chosen Sherry. And Lazarus had already had a confrontation with the woman who became his wife. Yet in the original investigation, Lazarus did not become the central suspect. That distinction would become one of the most important facts in the entire case. To understand why, it is necessary to return to the beginning before DNA, before the arrest, before the courtroom, and before the name Stephanie Lazarus became inseparable from the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. On the morning of February 24, 1986, Sherry was at home in the Van Nuys townhouse while her husband had left for work. At some point during the day, an attacker entered the home. What happened inside was violent. Sherry was beaten severely. She was shot 3 times in the chest. And at some point during the struggle, she bit her attacker, leaving a wound on her arm that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The crime scene also contained indications that the attacker had taken steps to control the sound of the gunfire. According to the prosecution's later account, a thick blanket had been used around the firearm, apparently to reduce the noise of the shots. But in 1986, investigators did not have the forensic tools that would later transform the meaning of the evidence. DNA analysis was not yet available in the way it would become decades later. The biological material left behind at the bite wound could not immediately identify the person responsible. Instead, investigators had to interpret the physical scene using the information and assumptions available to them at the time. Investigator Lyle Mayer believed that Sherry may have been killed by 2 men who had entered the home to commit a burglary. The circumstances of the scene appeared, to investigators, compatible with that explanation. The burglary theory became the framework through which the crime was understood. But Sherry's family was not convinced. Her father repeatedly urged police to investigate John's former girlfriend, the LAPD officer named Stephanie Lazarus. He even wrote to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates asking that Lazarus be examined as part of the investigation. The family's suspicion was not based on a random name. Lazarus had been romantically involved with John before Sherry entered his life. She had reportedly been deeply affected by John's relationship with Sherry, and she had already confronted Sherry at her workplace. From the family's perspective, those facts demanded attention. Yet Lazarus did not become the suspect they believed she should have been. According to the supplied case record, Mayer knew Lazarus's identity, but stated that he did not consider her a suspect. This decision would become one of the most troubling aspects of the case. The investigation had a theory two male burglars. The family had another possibility, a woman who had a direct emotional connection to Sherry's husband. The two paths never properly met, and while the murder remained unsolved, Stephanie Lazarus continued her life. She remained with the LAPD and eventually developed a substantial career within the department. She worked in patrol, later became an investigator, and ultimately specialized in art theft and fraud. She married another LAPD officer and built a family life of her own. For the outside world, there was no arrest, no trial, and no public resolution connecting her to Sherry's death. The murder instead became a cold case. Years passed. The physical evidence remained, but the investigation had moved on. The original theory had not produced a definitive answer, and the person Sherry's family had suspected had continued working as a police officer. Then, years later, the evidence from Sherry's bite wound was examined through a technology that had not been available to investigators in 1986. The biological material was found to contain DNA belonging to a woman. That discovery was significant because it challenged the original theory involving male burglars. There was now a biological clue pointing toward a female attacker. The DNA was entered into the National CODIS system, but initially there was no match. The evidence could identify a category of suspect, but not a name. The case remained unresolved. Then came 2009. LAPD investigators began reviewing unresolved murders, and the Rasmussen case was reconsidered. The female DNA became a central question. If the biological material belonged to a woman, investigators needed to determine who that woman might be. As they revisited people connected to Sherry, the name Stephanie Lazarus resurfaced. By then, the circumstances were dramatically different from those of 1986. Lazarus was no longer simply a former girlfriend whose name had been razed by a grieving family. She was a veteran member of the LAPD, someone who had spent approximately 25 years working in the department by the time of her arrest. Investigators now had to examine one of their own colleagues. The case had come full circle, but this time there was something the original investigation had never possessed: a biological trail that could potentially connect a person to the victim. Investigators proceeded discreetly. They followed Lazarus and eventually obtained a discarded cup that she had used. The DNA from that cup was compared with the biological material recovered from the bite wound on Sherry's arm. The result changed everything. The DNA matched Stephanie Lazarus. 23 years after Sherry Rasmussen was killed, a trace left during the struggle between victim and attacker had finally given investigators the identity they had been missing. But DNA alone was not the entire story. Prosecutors would later present the evidence as a larger chain: the former relationship between Lazarus and John Rudin, the emotional history surrounding that relationship, the confrontation with Sherry, the DNA from the bite wound, and evidence involving ammunition and a firearm consistent with what Lazarus had possessed. The case that had once been understood as a burglary was now being reconsidered as a murder rooted in a personal relationship, and the woman at the center of that new investigation was not someone who had spent decades running from police. She had spent those decades being one of them. That is what makes the story of Sherry Rasmussen so difficult to forget. The mystery was never simply about how a young woman died inside her own home. It was also about how an investigation could look directly at one possibility, follow another path, and leave a critical name outside the center of suspicion for more than 2 decades. Sherry's family had asked for that name to be examined in 1986. In 2009, forensic evidence finally forced investigators to look again. And once they did, the old case began to tell a very different story. Sherry Ray Rasmussen was 29 years old when her life ended. But the number alone cannot explain what was lost on February 24, 1986. In the years that followed, the murder would become known through the name of the woman eventually convicted of it, through the history of an investigation that went in the wrong direction, and through the DNA evidence that finally brought the case back to life. But before any of those things, there was Sherry herself. She was a young woman with a professional life in Los Angeles, working as a nursing administrator, and she had recently married John Rudin. Their marriage had taken place in late 1985, only a few months before Sherry was killed. That short period of time is one of the most painful elements of the case. Sherry was not simply beginning a marriage, she was beginning a future. Yet that future would last only a matter of months. To understand the circumstances that later surrounded her death, it is necessary to understand the relationship that existed before Sherry became John's wife. John Rudin had previously been involved in a romantic relationship with Stephanie Lazarus. According to the case information presented later at trial, Lazarus and Rudin had been together for several years. Their relationship had ended, and John eventually became involved with Sherry. The relationship between John and Sherry developed to the point where they married in late 1985. For Sherry, this was the beginning of a new stage in her life. For Lazarus, according to the prosecution's later interpretation of the evidence, the change was far more difficult. The prosecution argued that Lazarus remained emotionally attached to John and that his decision to marry Sherry created a powerful source of jealousy and resentment. That interpretation became central to the case many years later. But it is important to separate what was known about the relationships from what prosecutors eventually argued those relationships meant. The existence of the former relationship was a fact. John had been romantically involved with Lazarus. John later married Sherry. Lazarus knew about that marriage. What prosecutors later sought to establish was the meaning behind Lazarus's behavior and whether those circumstances provided a motive for murder. One piece of evidence presented at trial was a letter Lazarus had written to John's mother. Prosecutors used the letter as evidence that Lazarus's feelings toward John had remained significant. The letter became part of a larger picture they presented to the jury, one in which the end of Lazarus's relationship with John was not merely a closed chapter, but something that continued to affect her. Another event would later become particularly important. Lazarus had confronted Sherry at Sherry's workplace before the murder. The confrontation established that the two women were not complete strangers whose lives had merely intersected through John. There had already been direct contact between them. That fact would become more significant when investigators eventually reconstructed the circumstances surrounding Sherry's death. But in 1986, none of these details produced an arrest. The murder investigation followed a different path. Sherry's final day began like any other day in a life that had no reason to expect violence. She was at the townhouse in Van Nuys while John was away at work. At some point, an attacker entered the home. The encounter became violent. Sherry was beaten severely and shot 3 times in the chest. The injuries showed that this was not simply a case in which a person had been caught unaware and killed instantly. There was evidence of a struggle. Most importantly, there was a bite wound on Sherry's arm. That wound indicated physical contact between Sherry and her attacker, and the biological material left in connection with it would eventually become the forensic key to the case. But in 1986, the investigators did not have the ability to turn that material into an identification. The technology that would later allow DNA to identify a person was not yet available in the form required for this investigation. The evidence existed, but its full meaning remained hidden. The crime scene itself encouraged investigators to consider burglary. According to the supplied case information, investigator Lyle Mayer believed Sherry may have been killed by 2 men who had entered the home to commit a burglary. This theory offered an explanation for why an apparently violent stranger would have been inside Sherry's home. It also directed the investigation toward unknown intruders rather than toward people connected to the victim's personal life. And this was where Sherry's family saw the investigation differently. Her father repeatedly urged police to examine Stephanie Lazarus. His concern was not based on a distant rumor. He knew that Lazarus had been John's former girlfriend. He knew that John had married Sherry. He also knew that Lazarus was a police officer. The family believed that this relationship deserved serious attention. Sherry's father eventually went so far as to write to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, asking that Lazarus be investigated. Yet the name did not become the center of the investigation. According to the supplied case data, Mayer knew who Lazarus was but said he did not consider her a suspect. This decision would later become one of the most consequential aspects of the case. It is tempting, when looking backward from a conviction, to see the connection between Lazarus and Sherry as obvious. But hindsight can make a complicated investigation appear simpler than it was at the time. In 1986, the investigators were working without the DNA evidence that would later change the case. They had to interpret a violent crime scene and decide which explanation best fit what they could see. The burglary theory became the dominant explanation, while the family's concerns about Lazarus remained outside the main investigative direction. The passage of time then made the original decision increasingly difficult to reverse. Lazarus was not arrested. She continued her career with the LAPD. Over the following years, she worked in law enforcement and eventually became an investigator specializing in art theft and fraud. She married another LAPD officer and built a family life. Nothing about her continued career publicly resolved the question of Sherry's murder. Meanwhile, Sherry's family had to live with the fact that the person they believed should be investigated had never become the focus of the case. The contrast was stark. Sherry's life had stopped in 1986. Lazarus's life continued. One woman was remembered through an unresolved homicide file. The other continued working inside the police department. For years, the evidence remained silent. Then forensic science began to change what investigators could learn from old cases. The biological material connected to the bite wound on Sherry's arm was eventually examined through DNA testing. The results showed that the DNA belonged to a woman. That discovery was critical. The original theory had centered on two male burglars, but the biological evidence pointed toward a female attacker. The DNA was entered into Cody's, but there was initially no match. The evidence could say something important about the attacker, but it could not yet provide a name. The case therefore remained unsolved. Still, the meaning of the evidence had changed. The bite wound was no longer merely a sign that Sherry had fought for her life. It contained biological material capable of identifying the person who had been close enough to bite her or be bitten during the struggle. For more than 2 decades, that evidence had remained locked inside the old case. By 2009, investigators were prepared to look at the case differently. When LAPD detectives revisited unresolved murders, they returned to the Rasmussen investigation and reconsidered the female DNA. They began looking again at women who had connections to Sherry or reasons for conflict involving her. Stephanie Lazarus's name emerged once more. This time, however, the circumstances were completely different. The woman whose name Sherry's father had raised in 1986 was now a veteran LAPD officer, with approximately 25 years of service behind her. Investigators were no longer simply deciding whether to listen to a family suspicion. They had forensic evidence that required them to identify its source. The investigation was about to turn inward, toward one of the department's own officers. And the answer would come from a small biological trace left behind during the final struggle of Sherry Rasmussen's life. February 24, 1986, began as an ordinary day in Los Angeles, but by the time it ended, Sherry Rasmussen would be dead. Her home would become a crime scene, and a small piece of biological evidence would begin a journey that would eventually last more than 2 decades. Sherry was 29 years old. She was living in a townhouse in Van Nuys with her husband, John Rudin, whom she had married only a few months earlier. On that day, John left the house to go to work. Sherry remained behind. There was nothing in the information available about her final hours that suggested she knew she was in danger. At some point after John left, another person entered the home. What happened next was violent. Sherry was beaten severely and shot 3 times in the chest. The violence was not limited to the gunshots. There were indications that she had fought with her attacker, and on her arm was a bite wound. That wound would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. In the immediate aftermath, however, it was simply one part of a terrible scene. When John returned home later that day, he discovered his wife dead. The person he had left that morning alive was now gone. The home that had been part of their brief married life had become the location of an unexplained homicide. The circumstances were difficult to interpret. There was evidence of violence, evidence suggesting a struggle, and circumstances that led investigators toward the possibility that the crime had begun as a burglary. According to the investigation's original theory, two men may have entered the home to steal and encountered Sherry. If that interpretation was correct, the killing could have been the result of an intruder being confronted by the homeowner. It offered investigators a recognizable explanation for a violent death inside a residence. But the crime scene contained details that did not simply disappear into that explanation. Sherry had been beaten. She had been shot 3 times in the chest. She had fought with the person responsible strongly enough for a bite wound to be left on her arm. There was also evidence concerning the way the firearm had been used. According to the prosecution's later account, the attacker had used a thick blanket around the gun, apparently to reduce the sound of the shots. Prosecutors would eventually argue that this demonstrated a degree of control during the attack. At the time, however, the significance of every detail had to be assessed without the benefit of the later investigation. The investigators did not know what future forensic science would reveal. Most importantly, they could not yet turn the biological material associated with the bite into the identity of a person. DNA technology was not available in 1986 in the way it would later become available to cold case investigators. That limitation is essential to understanding why the case remained unsolved for so long. The evidence was physically present. The attacker had left something behind. But the technology required to translate that trace into an individual's identity did not yet exist in a practical forensic form for this investigation. In other words, the answer was already there, but no one could read it yet. The first investigators, therefore, had to construct their theory from the circumstances they could interpret. Investigator Lyle Mayer believed that Sherry may have been killed by 2 men who had entered the home to commit a burglary. The theory directed attention toward unknown male intruders rather than toward the people surrounding Sherry's personal life. Once an investigative theory takes shape, it can influence the questions that follow. If the crime is understood primarily as a burglary, investigators naturally look for evidence of burglars, possible entry points, stolen property, and other circumstances consistent with an intrusion. If the crime is understood as a personal killing, investigators may instead concentrate on relationships, conflicts, motives, and people who had reasons to harm the victim. In Sherry's case, the original investigation moved toward the first explanation. Her family, however, was looking in another direction. Sherry's father repeatedly asked investigators to examine Stephanie Lazarus, the former girlfriend of Sherry's husband. Lazarus was not a random person in the story. She had previously been romantically involved with John Rutan for several years. John had eventually become involved with Sherry, and by late 1985 he had married her. Lazarus, according to the evidence later presented by prosecutors, remained emotionally attached to John. There had also been a confrontation between Lazarus and Sherry at Sherry's workplace before the murder. Those facts gave the family a reason to believe that Lazarus should be investigated. Sherry's father did not simply mention her name once and move on. He repeatedly urged police to look at the former girlfriend. He eventually wrote to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates asking that Lazarus be considered. Yet Lazarus did not become the central focus of the investigation. According to the supplied case information, Mayer knew who Lazarus was but said he did not consider her a suspect. This was a critical divergence between the family's concerns and the investigative theory. The family saw a direct personal connection. The investigators saw a burglary. and the physical evidence available at the time did not provide the kind of definitive forensic identification that could force the two theories together. There was another unusual element to the case. Lazarus herself was a police officer. In 1986, she was approximately 26 years old and had already worked for the LAPD for about 2 years. That meant she was part of the same law enforcement institution investigating Sherry's death. But according to the information supplied, she was not arrested or treated as the principal suspect. Instead, she continued her career. This fact would become increasingly significant as the years passed. The case did not simply remain unsolved in the abstract. It remained unsolved while a person who would eventually be convicted continued to work within law enforcement. Sherry's family, meanwhile, had to live with the uncertainty surrounding her death. The original burglary theory did not produce a definitive identification of the killers. The person they had urged investigators to examine was not charged. The biological evidence from the bite wound remained unable to provide a name. And the years began to accumulate. 1 year became several. Several became decades. By the time DNA technology could be applied to the old evidence, the circumstances surrounding the murder had changed dramatically. Sherry was no longer a young woman whose death was being investigated as a recent homicide. She had become the victim of a decades-old cold case. Yet the physical evidence had not forgotten what happened. The bite wound remained part of the case. Eventually, when the biological material associated with it was tested, investigators discovered that it contained DNA belonging to a woman. That finding immediately challenged one of the fundamental assumptions of the original investigation. If the DNA belonged to a woman, then the theory that 2 male burglars were responsible could no longer explain the entire evidentiary picture. The discovery did not immediately solve the case. The DNA was entered into Cody's, but there was no match. Investigators had a female genetic profile, but they still did not know whose profile it was. The evidence had moved the case forward without completing it. For the first time, however, the investigation had a scientific clue that could be used to reconsider the people connected to Sherry. The question was no longer simply who might have wanted Sherry dead. It became something more precise. Whose DNA had been left behind during the struggle? That question would eventually bring investigators back to Stephanie Lazarus. But in 1986, no one had that answer. All they had was a dead woman, a violent crime scene, a theory of burglary, a family asking that another possibility be examined, and a biological trace whose significance would not become fully visible for years. Sherry had fought her attacker. In that struggle, something had been left behind. For more than 2 decades, it would remain one of the few silent witnesses to what happened inside that townhouse on February 24th, 1986. The investigation moved on, but the evidence stayed where it was, waiting for science to catch up with the crime. The first investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder began with a question that seemed straightforward but would eventually prove profoundly important. Who had entered the Van Nuys townhouse, and why had Sherry been killed? On February 24th, 1986, investigators were confronted with a violent crime inside a private home. Sherry was dead. She had been severely beaten and shot 3 times in the chest. There were signs that she had fought with her attacker, including a bite wound on her arm. Yet the circumstances did not immediately produce an obvious explanation. Instead, investigators developed a theory that would shape the direction of the case. Investigator Lyle Mayer believed that Sherry may have been killed by 2 men who had entered the residence to commit a burglary. The idea was that the violence had followed an intrusion, perhaps after Sherry encountered the people who had entered the house. It was a theory that placed the unknown outside the victim's personal world at the center of the investigation. The people responsible, under that interpretation, were strangers. They were burglars who had entered a home and killed its occupant. Once that framework became established, the investigation moved in that direction. But there was another theory, one that came from the people who knew Sherry best. Her family did not believe that the answer necessarily lay with unknown intruders. They were aware of a person whose connection to Sherry's husband made her impossible, in their view, to ignore. That person was Stephanie Lazarus. Lazarus was not merely someone who had crossed paths with Sherry. She had previously been romantically involved with John Rutan, Sherry's husband. According to the case information later presented at trial, Lazarus and John had been together for several years. Their relationship eventually ended, and John became involved with Sherry. By late 1985, John and Sherry were married. Only a few months later, Sherry was dead. The timeline alone did not establish guilt, but it established a relationship that Sherry's family believed investigators needed to examine carefully. There was more. Lazarus had reportedly been deeply affected by John's decision to marry Sherry. Prosecutors would later use a letter Lazarus had written to John's mother as evidence of her continuing emotional attachment to John. And before Sherry's death, Lazarus had confronted Sherry at her workplace. Again, none of these facts by themselves proved that Lazarus had committed a murder. But together, they formed the basis for the family's concern. Sherry's father repeatedly urged police to investigate Lazarus. He did not simply raise the possibility privately. He pressed the authorities to examine the woman he believed might have had a personal reason to harm his daughter. Eventually, he wrote directly to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, asking that Lazarus be investigated. The significance of that request becomes clearer when viewed from the perspective of the decades that followed. The family was not asking investigators to solve an abstract mystery. They were asking them to examine a specific person who had a direct connection to the victim's husband and who had already had a confrontation with Sherry. Yet Lazarus did not become the central suspect. According to the supplied case information, Mayer knew who Lazarus was but stated that he did not consider her a suspect. That decision became one of the most consequential moments in the history of the case. There is an important distinction between knowing that someone exists and investigating that person. As a suspect, Lazarus's name was known. Her connection to John was known. The family's concerns were known. But the investigation did not ultimately move toward her. Instead, the burglary theory remained dominant. That meant the case was effectively organized around the idea that Sherry's killer was an unknown male intruder or intruders rather than someone connected to her personal life. The difference between those two approaches was enormous. One required investigators to look outward, towards strangers who might have entered the house. The other required them to look inward, toward relationships, emotional conflicts, and people who had personal connections to Sherry and John. In a homicide investigation, the theory adopted early can influence how later evidence is interpreted. If investigators believe the crime is primarily a burglary, evidence can be understood through that lens. If investigators believe it is a personal killing, the same scene may prompt very different questions. In Sherry's case, the first theory did not lead to the identity of her killer. And there was another obstacle that would not become obvious until much later. The technology necessary to identify biological evidence did not yet exist in the form that would eventually transform the case. The bite wound on Sherry's arm was important, but in 1986 it could not identify the person who had been involved in the struggle. The biological material was there, but it could not yet speak with the precision that DNA analysis would eventually provide. Without that tool, investigators were left with the physical circumstances of the crime and the theories they developed from them. The absence of an immediate forensic identification meant that the burglary hypothesis could continue without being conclusively overturned. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus remained free and continued her career. She had been approximately 26 years old and had already served around 2 years as a LAPD officer when Sherry was killed. After the murder, she continued working for the department. Over time, her professional career developed. She worked in patrol, later became an investigator, and eventually specialized in art theft and fraud. She also married another LAPD officer and built a family life. None of those later events changed what had happened to Sherry, but they changed the context in which the case existed. While Sherry's family continued to live with the unanswered question of who had killed her, Lazarus continued to work within law enforcement. The person eventually convicted of Sherry's murder was not spending those years as a fugitive hiding from investigators. She was building a career. The contrast is one of the most striking elements of the case. Sherry's story had been interrupted permanently, while the life of the person eventually accused of killing her continued for more than 2 decades. But the murder itself never disappeared. It became a cold case, carrying with it the unresolved evidence from the original crime scene. The investigators' original theory had not produced the definitive answer the family needed. The suspicion surrounding Lazarus had not resulted in charges, and the physical evidence remained largely silent. Years later, advances in DNA testing changed that silence. The biological material associated with the bite wound was examined, and the DNA was determined to belong to a woman. This discovery was crucial because it challenged the original theory involving 2 male burglars. The biological evidence pointed toward a female participant in the struggle. Yet even this breakthrough did not immediately identify anyone. The DNA profile was entered into Cody's, but there was no match. The case remained unsolved. Still, the discovery had changed the nature of the investigation. A piece of evidence that had once been incapable of identifying anyone now provided a biological profile. The investigators had something that could eventually be compared with a specific person. The question became whether there was a woman connected to Sherry's life whose DNA could explain what had been found on the victim. That question would become particularly important when LAPD investigators revisited the case in 2009. By then, the passage of time had created distance from the original investigation. The officers who had first examined the murder were no longer necessarily approaching the evidence with the same assumptions. The female DNA offered a reason to reconsider the case from another angle. Investigators began looking again at women who had connections to Sherry or conflicts involving her. And once that process began, the name that Sherry's father had raised decades earlier returned to the investigation: Stephanie Lazarus. This time, however, Lazarus was not simply a former girlfriend mentioned by the victim's family. She was a veteran police officer, someone who had spent approximately 25 years working for the LAPD by the time the investigation reached its decisive stage. The investigators now faced a remarkable situation. They were not simply reopening an old murder. They were examining the possibility that one of their own colleagues might be connected to it. The old burglary theory had once pointed investigators toward unknown men. The new DNA evidence pointed toward a woman, and the family's long-standing suspicion pointed toward a woman who had a direct connection to Sherry's husband. The pieces were beginning to move toward the same place. But before investigators could make an arrest, they needed to establish whether the DNA recovered from Sherry's body actually belonged to Lazarus. That required a comparison, and obtaining that comparison without alerting her would become the next critical step in the investigation. After 23 years, the case was finally moving toward a moment when suspicion could be tested against physical evidence. For more than 2 decades, the murder of Sherry Rasmussen remained an unanswered question. The crime had happened in 1986, when DNA evidence could not yet provide the kind of identification that investigators would eventually depend upon. The original theory had centered on burglary and unknown male intruders. Sherry's family had repeatedly pointed investigators towards Stephanie Lazarus, but Lazarus had not become the principal suspect. She remained free, continued her career with the Los Angeles Police Department, and eventually became an experienced investigator herself. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from Sherry's final struggle remained preserved, waiting for forensic science to make it useful in a way that had not been possible when the murder occurred. The passage of time did not change what had happened to Sherry. It changed the tools available to understand it. In the years after the murder, Stephanie Lazarus continued her career within the LAPD. She had entered the department before Sherry was killed and remained there afterward. She worked in patrol, later became an investigator, and eventually specialized in art theft and fraud. She also married another LAPD officer and built a family life. From the perspective of someone looking at the case decades later, the contrast is difficult to ignore. One woman had lost her life at 29. Another woman, who would eventually be convicted of killing her, continued to live and work for years without being charged. Yet it is important to remain precise about what those years meant. The fact that Lazarus continued her career did not itself prove guilt. The conviction would eventually rest on evidence presented in court, including DNA, relationship history, and firearm-related evidence. But the length of time between the murder and the eventual arrest made the case extraordinary. A homicide that had once been investigated as a recent crime had gradually become part of the landscape of unresolved cases. Sherry's family had to carry the uncertainty with them. The person they believed should be investigated had never been formally established as the killer. The original theory had not produced an identified offender, and the forensic clue that would ultimately change the case had remained beyond the reach of investigators for years. That clue came from the bite wound on Sherry's arm. The wound was significant from the beginning because it showed that Sherry had fought with her attacker. But the biological material associated with that wound had a second significance that could not be fully appreciated in 1986. It contained DNA. When the material was eventually analyzed, investigators determined that the DNA belonged to a woman. That finding was more than a technical laboratory result. It directly challenged one of the basic assumptions behind the original investigation. The case had initially been interpreted through the theory of two male burglars. Now there was biological evidence associated with the victim that pointed toward a female. The old explanation was no longer as secure as it had once appeared. But the discovery still did not solve the murder. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the national database used to compare forensic DNA profiles, but there was no match. This meant that investigators knew something important about the person connected to the biological evidence, but they did not yet know who that person was. The result created an unusual situation. The case now had a scientifically defined clue, but no name attached to it. A female had apparently been involved in the struggle, yet the database could not identify her. For a period of time, the DNA represented possibility rather than resolution. The investigation still needed a person whose sample could be compared against it. Years later, the LAPD began reviewing unresolved murders. By 2009, the Rasmussen case was reconsidered with the benefit of both time and improved forensic capabilities. Investigators returned to the evidence and asked a question that had not been answered in 1986. If the DNA belonged to a woman, who among the people connected to Sherry might be the source? That question shifted the investigation away from the original assumption of unknown male burglars and toward the people surrounding the victim's life. Investigators began looking again at women who had relationships or conflicts involving Sherry. Among those names was Stephanie Lazarus. The significance of her name was different now than it had been in 1986. In the original investigation, she had been someone Sherry's family wanted police to examine. By 2009, she was a veteran LAPD officer who had spent approximately 25 years within the department. Investigators were now considering the possibility that the female DNA from Sherry's body could belong to a fellow officer. This created an extraordinary investigative problem. The detectives were not searching for an unknown person in the abstract. They were investigating someone who knew police procedures, had worked inside the department, and had spent decades as part of the same law enforcement institution. The investigation, therefore, had to be conducted discreetly. Investigators followed Lazarus and sought a way to obtain a DNA sample without alerting her to the investigation. Eventually, they obtained a discarded cup that Lazarus had used. The sample from that cup could now be compared directly with the biological evidence recovered from Sherry. This was the moment when the case moved from suspicion to forensic testing. The investigators had the DNA from the bite wound. They had a sample from Lazarus. The question was no longer theoretical. It was a direct scientific comparison. The result was decisive. The DNA matched Stephanie Lazarus. After 23 years, investigators had identified the woman whose biological material had been left behind during the struggle with Sherry. The evidence did not exist in isolation. It connected to the history that had surrounded the case from the beginning. Lazarus had once been romantically involved with John Rudin. John had eventually married Sherry. Lazarus had reportedly remained emotionally attached to John, and prosecutors would later present evidence of that attachment, including the letter to John's mother. Lazarus had also confronted Sherry at her workplace before the murder. These facts had existed long before the DNA match, but they had not been enough to transform Lazarus into the central suspect in 1986. The DNA changed their significance. What had once been a relationship history that might or might not have been relevant to a murder now stood alongside physical evidence connecting Lazarus to Sherry's final struggle. The investigators also examined firearm-related evidence. According to the case information, ammunition used in the killing was associated with the type of ammunition issued to LAPD officers at the time. Experts also linked the characteristics of the bullets to a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber short-barrel firearm, similar to one Lazarus had possessed. Another important fact concerned that weapon. Lazarus had owned a firearm fitting the relevant description and later reported that it had been lost or stolen. These details would eventually become part of the prosecution's broader evidentiary case. Still, the DNA was the turning point. Without the DNA match, the connection between Lazarus and the murder might have remained a matter of suspicion and history. With the match, investigators had a direct biological link between Lazarus and the evidence left on Sherry's body. The cold case was no longer simply a murder with an unidentified killer. It had become an investigation centered on a specific person. The next step was no longer to determine whether the case could be reopened. It was to determine how investigators would proceed against a veteran police officer who had remained outside the investigation for more than 2 decades. On June 5, 2009, that question was answered. Stephanie Lazarus was arrested at LAPD headquarters in Los Angeles. She had spent approximately 25 years working for the department. Now, inside the very institution where she had built her career, she was being arrested in connection with a murder that had taken place 23 years earlier. The case had come full circle. In 1986, Sherry's family had asked police to investigate Lazarus. For years, that suspicion had remained unresolved. Then forensic science revealed that the attacker had left behind biological evidence, and that evidence ultimately matched Lazarus. The arrest did not erase the years that had passed, and it did not undo the original investigative decisions, but it transformed the status of the case. The question was no longer whether the woman Sherry's family had suspected should be examined. Investigators now had evidence that required the courts to determine what had happened. The case that had survived 23 years of silence was finally moving toward a courtroom. By 2009, the murder of Sherry Rasmussen had existed for so long that the original investigation belonged to another era. Sherry had been killed in 1986, when the forensic tools that would eventually transform the case were not yet available. Stephanie Lazarus, once simply the former girlfriend of Sherry's husband and a name raised by Sherry's family, had spent the intervening years building a career within the Los Angeles Police Department. She was no longer a young officer with only a few years of experience. She was a veteran investigator. And now, more than 2 decades after Sherry's death, detectives were beginning to look at the case from an entirely different direction. The change began with the evidence preserved from Sherry's body. The bite wound on her arm had always been significant because it indicated that she had struggled with her attacker. But the biological material associated with that wound eventually provided something that investigators in 1986 could not have obtained: A DNA profile. The profile belonged to a woman. That fact challenged the original theory of the crime. The first investigation had focused on the possibility that two men had entered Sherry's home to commit a burglary. But if the biological evidence recovered from the struggle came from a woman, investigators now had to consider a very different possibility. The person connected to that evidence might not have been an unknown male intruder at all. The DNA profile was entered into Cody's, but it did not produce a match. The discovery, therefore, did not immediately solve the case. Investigators knew they were looking for a woman, but the database could not tell them who she was. The evidence had narrowed the field without identifying the individual. That distinction mattered. A DNA profile can be powerful, but its usefulness depends on having something against which it can be compared. Until investigators had a known sample from a person of interest, the profile remained an unidentified biological clue. In 2009, the Rasmussen case was among the unresolved murders that investigators revisited. The passage of time had not eliminated the evidence, and the development of forensic science meant that evidence collected decades earlier could now be interpreted differently. Detectives began reconsidering the circumstances surrounding Sherry's death, including the female DNA. They looked again at women who had connections to Sherry and at women who might have had conflicts involving her. It was in this process that Stephanie Lazarus's name returned to the center of the investigation. The return of her name was striking because Sherry's family had raised it decades earlier. In 1986, Sherry's father had repeatedly urged police to investigate John's former girlfriend. He had even written to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. But Lazarus had not become the focus of the original investigation. Now, however, the circumstances were different. The investigators were not relying solely on the family's suspicion. They had biological evidence showing that a woman had been involved in the struggle with Sherry. Lazarus was a woman with a direct connection to Sherry's husband and a known history involving Sherry. She was also still a member of the LAPD. The investigation had therefore reached an unusual and delicate point. Detectives were examining one of their own. The person they were investigating understood law enforcement. She knew the institution, knew investigative procedures, and had spent most of her adult professional life within the department. The inquiry had to be handled carefully. Investigators followed Lazarus and looked for a way to obtain a DNA sample without informing her of the investigation. Eventually, they obtained a discarded cup that Lazarus had used. That cup provided the known DNA sample investigators needed. The comparison was now possible. On one side was the unidentified biological material recovered from Sherry's bite wound. On the other was a DNA sample associated with Stephanie Lazarus. The scientific comparison produced the result that transformed the investigation. The DNA matched Lazarus. After 23 years, investigators had a forensic connection between Lazarus and Sherry's body. The significance of the match was enormous, but prosecutors did not treat it as the only evidence. Instead, the DNA became part of a larger chain of circumstances that had existed around the case for decades. Lazarus had been romantically involved with John Rutan before his relationship with Sherry. The prosecution later argued that she remained emotionally attached to him. Evidence presented at trial included the letter she had written to John's mother. There had also been a confrontation between Lazarus and Sherry at Sherry's workplace before the murder. Those facts had been known in some form long before the DNA match. But without physical evidence, they had not produced a prosecution. The DNA gave them a different context. Investigators could now examine the relationship history alongside a biological link to the victims. Final struggle. The firearm evidence added another layer. According to the supplied case information, the ammunition used in the killing was of a type associated with ammunition issued to LAPD officers at the time. Experts also concluded that the markings on the bullets were consistent with a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber short-barreled firearm, similar to one Lazarus had possessed. Lazarus had owned a firearm fitting the relevant description and later reported that it had been lost or stolen. These facts would become part of the prosecution's case, but it was important to understand how they functioned differently from the DNA. The DNA provided a direct biological comparison. The firearm evidence and relationship history were circumstances that prosecutors used to build the broader explanation of what happened. Together, they created a narrative that was very different from the original burglary theory. The case was no longer centered on two unknown men who might have entered a home to steal. It was centered on a woman who had a personal connection to the victim's husband, had previously confronted the victim, and whose DNA was found in biological material associated with a struggle with the victim. The investigation had effectively turned inward. Instead of searching beyond the victim's personal world, detectives were now examining someone who had been connected to that world from the beginning. The irony was impossible to overlook. Stephanie Lazarus had spent her career investigating crimes while the evidence in Sherry Rasmussen's murder remained unresolved. She had worked within the LAPD for approximately 25 years. Now investigators from that same institution were quietly gathering evidence against her. The case was not solved through a confession or through an eyewitness stepping forward. It was being rebuilt from evidence that had existed for years but could not previously provide an identification. The bite wound had been there in 1986. The biological material had been preserved. The DNA technology came later, and once investigators could identify the biological source, the old investigative assumptions began to collapse. Still, the DNA match did not itself answer every question about the murder. It did not, by itself, explain exactly what had happened inside the townhouse or establish the entire sequence of events. Those questions would eventually be addressed through the legal process. Investigators now had to move from forensic identification to prosecution. They had to determine whether the evidence as a whole could establish that Lazarus had intentionally killed Sherry. That meant examining motive, relationship history, firearm evidence, and the circumstances of the physical struggle. It also meant confronting the fact that so much time had passed. Nearly a quarter of a century separated the crime from the investigation that finally identified a suspect. On June 5, 2009, the process reached its next decisive stage. Stephanie Lazarus was arrested at LAPD headquarters in Los Angeles. The location itself captured the extraordinary reversal at the heart of the case. A person who had spent decades working as a police officer was now being taken into custody by police. She had not been arrested in 1986. She had not disappeared from the community. She had remained within law enforcement while the Rasmussen case sat unresolved. Now, after the DNA comparison, the institution was forced to confront the possibility that one of its own officers had been responsible. The arrest brought the 23-year investigation into public view. But it also marked the beginning of another phase, one that would be decided not by detectives, but by a jury. The prosecution would have to present the evidence and establish a coherent case. The defense would challenge the meaning and reliability of that evidence, and the jury would ultimately have to decide whether the woman who had continued her life for decades was responsible for the death of Sherry Rasmussen. The investigation had finally found its suspect. The next question was whether it had enough evidence to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. By the time Stephanie Lazarus was arrested on June 5, 2009, the case of Sherry Rasmussen had already crossed a boundary that few homicide investigations ever reach. Nearly 23 years had passed since Sherry was killed. The original investigators had followed a burglary theory. Sherry's family had pointed towards Stephanie Lazarus. The physical evidence had remained in the case file, waiting for forensic science to catch up. Now DNA evidence had connected Lazarus to biological material from the bite wound on Sherry's arm. But an arrest was not the same thing as a conviction. The investigators had identified their suspect, but the courts still had to determine whether the evidence established that Lazarus was responsible for Sherry's death. The arrest itself was extraordinary. Lazarus was taken into custody at LAPD headquarters in Los Angeles. By that point, She had spent approximately 25 years working for the department. She had begun her career as a young officer and eventually become an investigator, specializing in art theft and fraud. Now, inside the institution where she had spent decades serving as a police officer, she was being arrested in connection with a murder committed before much of her career had even unfolded. The case immediately presented a stark contrast between the person Lazarus had become and the crime investigators believed she had committed. For years, she had been a member of law enforcement. She understood police work and investigative procedures. But the prosecution's case would not depend simply on her profession or on the suspicion that had surrounded her name for years. It would depend on evidence. At trial, prosecutors presented the case as a combination of motive, relationship history, DNA, and firearm evidence. The first element was the relationship between Lazarus and John Rudin. Before John married Sherry, he had been romantically involved with Lazarus for several years. John eventually chose Sherry, and the two married in late 1985. The prosecution argued that Lazarus remained emotionally attached to John and that his marriage to Sherry created a powerful motive for the killing. This interpretation was supported in the prosecution's presentation by evidence of Lazarus's emotional response to the relationship and by a letter she had written to John's mother. The letter became part of the effort to show the jury that the relationship with John had remained significant to Lazarus. Prosecutors also pointed to Lazarus's confrontation with Sherry at Sherry's workplace before the murder. That confrontation mattered because it established that the two women had interacted directly. They were not simply connected through a man who belonged to both of their histories. There had been a personal encounter between them before Sherry died. The prosecution used the relationship history and the confrontation as part of the larger explanation for why Lazarus might have wanted Sherry dead, but motive alone could not prove murder. The central physical evidence was the DNA. Sherry had been involved in a struggle with her attacker. A bite wound had been left on her arm, and biological material associated with that wound eventually yielded a female DNA profile. After investigators revisited the case in 2009, they secretly obtained a discarded cup used by Lazarus. The DNA from that cup was compared with the material recovered from Sherry. The result was a match. For the prosecution, this was the critical bridge between Lazarus and the crime scene. It placed her biological material in connection with a wound that indicated a physical struggle between Sherry and the person who attacked her. The defense challenged the significance of the evidence and sought to weaken the prosecution's interpretation of the DNA and other circumstances. But the case did not depend on a single piece of evidence. Prosecutors also presented firearm-related evidence. According to the supplied case information, the ammunition used in the killing was associated with ammunition issued to LAPD officers at the time. Experts further concluded that the characteristics of the bullets were consistent with a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber short-barreled firearm, similar to one Lazarus had possessed. Lazarus had owned a firearm fitting the relevant description and later reported that it had been lost or stolen. This evidence became another component of the prosecution's argument. The significance of the firearm evidence was not that possession of a similar weapon automatically established guilt. Rather, prosecutors used it alongside the DNA and relationship evidence to create a broader chain of circumstances. The jury was asked to consider all of those elements together. The prosecution's theory was that Lazarus had a personal motive connected to John Rudin, had a history of conflict with Sherry, was connected by DNA to the physical struggle, and had a history involving a firearm relevant to the ballistic evidence. The defense, meanwhile, denied the accusation and attempted to undermine the prosecution's evidence. The trial therefore became a contest over interpretation. The question was not simply whether Lazarus had once loved John or whether she had possessed a firearm. Those facts by themselves did not establish that she had killed Sherry. The question was whether the combination of evidence established the prosecution's theory beyond a reasonable doubt. This distinction was especially important because the murder had occurred 26 years before. The eventual conviction. Memories had aged. The original investigation had taken place in a different forensic era. The case had to be reconstructed from evidence preserved over decades and from events that had happened long before the trial. The prosecution's strongest advantage was that some of the evidence was not dependent on memory. DNA does not depend on a witness remembering a conversation from 1986. The biological material associated with Sherry's bite wound had remained part of the case, and the later comparison with Lazarus provided a direct forensic connection. At the same time, the prosecution had to place that connection within the larger circumstances of the murder. Sherry had been killed in her home. She had been beaten and shot 3 times in the chest. She had struggled with her attacker. The person whose DNA was identified in connection with the bite wound was a woman who had a direct personal connection to Sherry's husband. These elements gave the jury a framework for considering the evidence. The defense's challenge was to prevent that framework from becoming a conclusion based merely on suspicion. But after hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. On March 8, 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict brought a formal end to the criminal trial, but it also gave the case a significance beyond the courtroom. The woman Sherry's father had urged police to investigate in 1986 had now been convicted of Sherry's murder. The biological evidence from the bite wound had helped establish the connection that had been missing for decades. The burglary theory that had shaped the original investigation was no longer the explanation accepted by the criminal justice system. The case had moved from an unidentified homicide to a first-degree murder conviction. Yet even with the verdict, the story was not entirely finished. Lazarus still faced sentencing, and the legal process would continue through appeals. The jury's decision established criminal responsibility, but the next stage would determine the punishment. On May 11, 2012, Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, with parole consideration according to the applicable rules. By then, approximately 26 years had passed since Sherry's murder. For Sherry's family, the verdict represented an answer that had taken decades to arrive. But the passage of time could not be reversed. The conviction could identify the person responsible, but it could not restore Sherry's life, return the years her family had spent without an answer, or change the fact that the investigation had initially followed another path. The case therefore remained more than a story about a murder conviction. It became a story about the consequences of an early investigative theory, the limits of forensic science in 1986, and the eventual power of evidence preserved long enough for technology to make it meaningful. In the end, the prosecution did not need a dramatic confession to resolve the case. It relied on a collection of facts that had survived the passage of time: a relationship, a confrontation, a bite wound, DNA, firearm evidence, and the history surrounding the people involved. Together, those pieces persuaded a jury. The woman who had once been a police officer investigating crimes was now a convicted murderer. And the case that had begun with a dead woman in a Van Nuys townhouse had finally reached the courtroom, where the unanswered question of who killed Sherry Rasmussen received its legal answer. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus on March 8, 2012, brought a formal conclusion to the trial over the murder of Sherry Rasmussen, but it did not erase the years that had passed between the crime and the verdict. Sherry had been killed in 1986. By the time a jury found Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder, approximately 26 years had passed. For most of that period, Sherry's family had lived without the certainty that comes with knowing who was responsible for a loved one's death. The case had remained unresolved while Lazarus continued her career within the Los Angeles Police Department. The verdict finally established a legal answer, but it could not restore what had been lost. On May 11, 2012, Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, with parole consideration under the applicable rules. The sentence represented the final stage of the trial court proceedings, but the case would continue through the appellate process. Lazarus challenged her conviction, and the California Court of Appeal later reviewed several of the issues raised by her defense. Among the matters considered were the long delay between the murder and prosecution, search warrants, pre-arrest questioning, and the use of DNA evidence. The appellate court ultimately upheld the conviction. That decision was significant because it meant that the verdict reached in 2012 remained intact. After further legal review, the case had therefore moved through several distinct stages: the murder in 1986, the long period in which it remained unresolved, the renewed investigation in 2009, Lazarus's arrest, the trial in 2012, the conviction, the sentence, and the subsequent appeal. But even after the legal process had established responsibility, the deeper questions raised by the case remained. The most obvious was how the investigation could have gone for so long without identifying Lazarus as the central suspect. The facts available to investigators in 1986 were not the same as those available in 2009. There was no DNA identification capable of resolving the bite wound evidence. Investigators had to work from the physical scene and the information available to them. Lyle Mayer believed that two men may have entered the home to commit a burglary. That theory shaped the investigation. At the same time, Sherry's father repeatedly asked police to investigate Stephanie Lazarus, pointing to her relationship with John Rudin. He eventually wrote to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. The family's suspicion did not result in Lazarus becoming the principal suspect. According to the supplied case information, Mayer knew Lazarus's identity but did not consider her a suspect. Looking back, this contrast is one of the most difficult aspects of the case. The family had identified a person with a direct connection to Sherry's husband, yet the investigation moved toward unknown male burglars. The case therefore illustrates how an early investigative theory can influence the direction of a homicide investigation, particularly when decisive forensic evidence is unavailable. It is important, however, not to turn hindsight into certainty about what individual investigators should have known at the time. The original investigation took place in 1986. DNA technology had not yet reached the point where the biological evidence from Sherry's struggle could provide the identification it eventually supplied. The investigators had to interpret a crime scene without a tool that would later become central to the case. What appeared to be an unidentified burglary-related homicide in 1986 could be reconsidered decades later using methods that simply did not exist in practical forensic use at the time. That is why the bite wound is so important to the history of the case. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, it was evidence that Sherry had fought with her attacker. Years later, it became something more, a source of biological material that could be compared with a known sample. When the DNA from that material was found to belong to a woman, the original theory involving two male burglars was challenged. When investigators later obtained DNA from a discarded cup used by Lazarus and found a match, the case changed completely. The evidence that had once been silent could now speak. The DNA did not exist because the investigators of 2009 created it. It had been left behind during the struggle in 1986. The difference was that technology had finally made the evidence useful. That is one of the most striking elements of the Rasmussen case. The passage of time did not destroy every clue. Some evidence became more valuable as forensic science advanced. The case also demonstrates the importance of looking at evidence as a whole. The conviction was not presented as resting on DNA alone. Prosecutors connected the DNA evidence with Lazarus's history with John Rudin, her emotional attachment to him as presented by the prosecution, her confrontation with Sherry, and firearm-related evidence. The prosecution argued that these elements formed a coherent explanation for the murder. The defense challenged the evidence and denied the accusation. Ultimately, the jury accepted the prosecution's case and found Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder. For Sherry's family, the legal conclusion brought something that had been absent since 1986: an identified and convicted killer. But justice arriving decades later has a complicated meaning. A conviction can answer the question of who is responsible, but it cannot answer every question left behind by a death. It cannot give Sherry back to the people who loved her. It cannot return the years during which her family had to live with uncertainty. It cannot change the fact that she was 29 years old when her life ended. And it cannot erase the reality that the person eventually convicted had spent decades building a life and career while the murder remained unresolved. The case also forces attention back towards Sherry herself. It is easy for a long-running true crime story to become dominated by the identity of the accused and the unusual circumstances of the investigation. Lazarus's career as a police officer, the DNA breakthrough, the arrest at LAPD headquarters, and the courtroom proceedings are all dramatic elements. But none of them should overshadow the person at the center of the original tragedy. Sherry was a young professional. She had married John only months before her death. She had a life that was still unfolding. Her future was interrupted inside the home, where she should have been safe. For decades, her story was defined by the absence of an answer. The eventual conviction changed that part of the story, but it did not change the loss itself. There is another important contrast in the case: the difference between suspicion and proof. Sherry's father suspected Lazarus in 1986. That suspicion was real and persistent, but suspicion alone could not establish criminal responsibility. The investigation eventually required physical evidence capable of connecting a specific person to the crime. That evidence came decades later through DNA. The story therefore moved from suspicion to identification, and then from identification to a courtroom judgment. That progression matters. It shows why unresolved homicide investigations can remain uncertain for years and why new forensic evidence can completely transform an old case. The Rasmussen case also demonstrates how the passage of time can change the meaning of an investigation. In 1986, Lazarus was a young LAPD officer whose name did not become central to the case. In 2009, she was a veteran investigator and a suspect whose DNA could be compared with evidence from the victim. In 2012, she was a convicted murderer. 3 different moments, separated by decades, placed the same person in completely different positions relative to the case. The legal process eventually confirmed the conviction, and the appellate court later upheld it. Yet the final meaning of the case is not simply that a cold murder was solved. It is that the answer had been present in fragments all along, in the relationship history, in the family's concerns, in the physical evidence, and most importantly, in the biological trace left during Sherry's final struggle. None of those pieces alone told the complete story. Together, after decades of investigation and technological change, they became enough to establish criminal responsibility. In the end, the story returns to February 24, 1986. Sherry Rasmussen entered that day as a 29-year-old woman with a profession, a recent marriage, and a future ahead of her. She did not know that her life was about to become the center of a murder investigation that would last for decades. She could not know that a bite wound left during her struggle would preserve a clue that investigators would eventually use to identify her killer. She could not know that her family would continue asking questions long after the original investigation had moved elsewhere. And she could not know that, more than 2 decades later, the investigation would turn back toward the person her family had once named. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus provided the legal answer to Sherry's murder. But the enduring lesson of the case lies in the evidence that survived, the questions that were never fully resolved in 1986, and the persistence of those who continued to seek an answer. Sherry's life was interrupted in a matter of minutes, but her case endured for 26 years before reaching a verdict. In the end, it was not a dramatic confession or a sudden discovery that brought the case to its conclusion. It was the gradual convergence of old evidence and new forensic science. A relationship that had once seemed peripheral, A confrontation that had been remembered, a firearm connection, and a tiny biological trace preserved on the body of a woman who had fought for her life. For decades, that trace could not speak. Eventually, it did. And when it did, the direction of the entire case changed forever. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus did not erase the 26 years that separated Sherry Rasmussen's death from the final judgment. On March 8, 2012, a jury found Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder. On May 11th, she was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. For the legal system, these decisions marked the conclusion of the trial. For Sherry's family, however, the meaning was more complicated. They finally had an answer to the question that had followed them since February 24, 1986. Who was responsible for Sherry's death? But an answer arriving decades later could never restore the life that had been taken. Sherry had been 29 years old. She had been working as a nurse manager in Los Angeles and had married John Rutan only a few months before she was killed. Her life had been interrupted at a point when her future was still unfolding. The conviction could establish responsibility, but it could not return any of those years. It could not undo the shock of finding her dead inside her own home. It could not change the years during which her family had continued to live with uncertainty. And it could not alter the fact that the investigation had initially followed a very different path. That early direction became one of the most enduring questions surrounding the case. From the beginning, investigators had considered the possibility that Sherry had been killed by burglars. Investigator Lyle Mayer believed that two men may have entered the home to steal, and that the killing followed an encounter with Sherry. The theory had an apparent logic based on the circumstances investigators believed they were seeing. But it also meant that the investigation concentrated on unknown male intruders rather than on the people connected to Sherry's personal life. Sherry's father did not accept that explanation. He repeatedly urged investigators to examine Stephanie Lazarus, pointing specifically to her previous relationship with John Rutan. He eventually wrote to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. The family's suspicion was not enough to prove that Lazarus had committed murder. But in hindsight, it became one of the most striking features of the case. The person the family had identified in 1986 was eventually the person convicted in 2012. Yet between those 2 points lay more than 2 decades in which Lazarus remained outside the case as a charged suspect. This raises a difficult issue about the nature of investigations. What happens when an early theory becomes stronger than the unanswered questions surrounding it? The Rasmussen case demonstrates how a theory can determine what investigators look for and, equally important, what they may not emphasize. If the murder is understood as a burglary, investigators search for burglars. If it is understood as a personal killing, investigators examine relationships, conflicts, motives, and people who may have had reasons to harm the victim. In 1986, the available forensic technology could not provide the decisive evidence that would eventually change the case. The bite wound on Sherry's arm was known. Investigators knew that a struggle had occurred, but they could not use DNA in the way investigators later could. The biological evidence was there, but its identity remained hidden. Years later, that changed. DNA extracted from the material associated with the bite wound showed that the biological source was a woman. The result undermined the original assumption that the attackers were 2 men. It did not immediately identify the woman, because the profile entered into Cody's produced no match. Yet it created a new direction for the case. Investigators could now ask which woman connected to Sherry might account for the DNA. When the LAPD reopened the case in 2009, Stephanie Lazarus's name returned. This time, the circumstances were dramatically different. She was no longer simply a former girlfriend mentioned by Sherry's family. She was a veteran LAPD investigator who had spent approximately 25 years working for the department. Investigators were examining one of their own. They followed Lazarus and eventually obtained a discarded cup she had used. The DNA from that cup matched the DNA associated with Sherry's bite wound. That result transformed the investigation. The biological evidence could now be connected to a specific person. But the prosecution did not stop with DNA. At trial, prosecutors presented a broader case. They described Lazarus's previous relationship with John Ruetten and argued that she remained emotionally attached to him after he married Sherry. They introduced evidence, including a letter Lazarus had written to John's mother. They also presented evidence concerning Lazarus's confrontation with Sherry at Sherry's workplace before the murder. These details provided the prosecution's theory of motive and relationship. Firearm evidence added another part of the case. According to the supplied case information, the ammunition used in the killing was associated with ammunition issued to LAPD officers at the time. Experts found that the markings on the bullets were consistent with a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber short-barreled firearm, similar to one Lazarus had possessed. Lazarus had owned a firearm fitting the relevant description and later reported that it had been lost or stolen. Again, no single circumstance was presented as the entire explanation. The prosecution's argument depended upon the combination of evidence. The DNA connected Lazarus to the physical struggle. The relationship history provided a possible motive. The confrontation with Sherry demonstrated a direct personal conflict. The firearm evidence supplied another connection to the circumstances of the killing. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of this evidence. Ultimately, however, the jury accepted the prosecution's case and found Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction was followed by the sentence of 27 years to life. But the legal story did not end there. Lazarus appealed her conviction, and the California Court of Appeal later considered several arguments raised by her defense. Among the issues examined were the lengthy delay between the murder and the prosecution, search warrants, pre-arrest questioning, and the use of DNA evidence. The appellate court upheld the conviction. That decision was important because it confirmed that the verdict remained legally intact after further review. The case therefore passed through more than one level of judgment. It was not simply an arrest followed by a conviction. The evidence and the procedures surrounding the prosecution were also examined through the appellate process. Yet even after the appeal, one fact remained impossible to change. The investigation had taken approximately 23 years to reach the decisive breakthrough and roughly 26 years to reach the conviction. Time is one of the most difficult elements in any cold case. Witness memories can become distant. Investigative assumptions can become embedded in old files. People connected to the original events can build entirely different lives. And the victim remains permanently at the point where her life ended. In Sherry's case, the person eventually convicted did not spend those years as someone hiding from the law. Lazarus continued working for the LAPD. She advanced from patrol work to investigative duties and eventually specialized in art theft and fraud. She married another LAPD officer and built a family life. The contrast is difficult to ignore, but it should not distract from the evidence that ultimately established the case in court. Her career was not proof of guilt. Her professional position did, however, make the eventual arrest particularly striking. On June 5, 2009, Lazarus was arrested at LAPD headquarters. The institution in which she had spent decades working had become the institution investigating and arresting her. The circumstances made the case unusual, but the core story remained about Sherry. The most important piece of evidence was not the fact that Lazarus was a police officer. It was the biological evidence preserved from the victim. Sherry's body had carried a clue from the moment of her death. During the struggle, her attacker left biological material at the bite wound. For many years, that evidence could not identify anyone. Eventually, technology transformed it into a DNA profile. Then investigators found a way to compare that profile with Lazarus. The result gave the case the connection it had lacked. In that sense, the passage of time worked in two directions. It delayed justice, but it also allowed forensic science to develop. Evidence that had once been insufficient became powerful decades later. The Rasmussen case, therefore, became an example of how a cold case can change when old evidence is examined with new tools. But technology alone did not solve the murder. The DNA had to be recognized as significant. Investigators had to reconsider the original theory. They had to revisit women connected to Sherry. They had to return to a name that Sherry's family had raised years earlier. And they had to obtain a comparison sample without Lazarus knowing that she was under investigation. The eventual conviction emerged from the interaction of all those elements. Perhaps the most enduring question is not simply why it took so long to identify Lazarus, but how different the investigation might have looked if the biological evidence had been usable in 1986. There is no way to rewrite that history. The investigators of the time did not have the same forensic capabilities available decades later. The burglary theory became the central explanation, while the family's suspicion remained outside the main direction of the investigation. Only later did science provide a way to test the alternative. The result was devastatingly clear. The DNA from the bite wound belonged to Stephanie Lazarus. The case that had once seemed to point toward unknown male burglars now pointed toward a woman who had known Sherry and had been connected to her husband. The legal process ultimately accepted that interpretation. But for Sherry's family, the most important fact was simpler. Sherry had not been forgotten. Her case had remained unresolved, but the evidence had survived. The questions her family raised had remained relevant. And eventually, after decades of uncertainty, the criminal justice system reached a verdict. Sherry's story had begun with a young woman returning to an ordinary home in Van Nuys and ended with a courtroom judgment more than a quarter of a century later. Between those moments were missed possibilities, unanswered questions, technological limitations, renewed investigation, and evidence that waited years before it could be understood. The verdict could not give Sherry her future back. What it could do was give her family something they had been denied for decades: a definitive legal conclusion about who had killed her. And sometimes, in a cold case, that conclusion is the final thing a family has left to seek. By the time the legal proceedings surrounding Stephanie Lazarus had reached their later stages, the murder of Sherry Rasmussen had become more than an unresolved homicide from 1986. It had become a case about time, investigative assumptions, forensic science, and the persistence of a family that had refused to accept an explanation they believed did not fit what had happened. Sherry was killed on February 24, 1986, inside her home in Van Nuys. She was 29 years old, a nurse manager, and newly married to John Rutan. Her death was violent and sudden. She was severely beaten, shot 3 times in the chest, and left with a bite wound on her arm that indicated a struggle. That wound would eventually become the physical clue that connected the past to the future. But in 1986, investigators did not have the forensic technology needed to turn the biological material from that wound into a name. Instead, the investigation developed around a different explanation. Lyle Mayer believed that 2 men may have entered the home to commit a burglary. That theory directed attention toward unknown intruders. Sherry's family, however, believed there was another possibility. Her father repeatedly urged investigators to examine Stephanie Lazarus, the former girlfriend of Sherry's husband. Lazarus had been romantically involved with John Rutan for several years before John became involved with Sherry. By late 1985, John and Sherry had married. Before Sherry's death, Lazarus had also confronted her at her workplace. These circumstances did not constitute proof of murder by themselves, but they established a personal connection that Sherry's family considered important enough to bring directly to police. Her father even wrote to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates. Yet Lazarus did not become the central focus of the investigation. She continued working for the LAPD, eventually becoming an investigator and specializing in art theft and fraud. For more than 2 decades, the case remained unresolved. Then forensic science changed what investigators could see. DNA recovered from the biological material associated with Sherry's bite wound was identified as belonging to a woman. That discovery challenged the original theory involving two male burglars. The DNA was entered into Cody's, but there was no match. The evidence had identified the biological sex of the contributor without identifying the person. The case remained open, waiting for investigators to find a way to connect that profile with a known individual. In 2009, investigators revisited the murder. They reconsidered the women connected to Sherry and the circumstances surrounding her death. Stephanie Lazarus's name resurfaced. The significance of that name was now different because investigators had something they had not possessed in 1986, a female DNA profile from the victim's body. Lazarus was still working for the LAPD, making the investigation unusually sensitive. Detectives followed her and eventually obtained a discarded cup she had used. The DNA from the cup was compared with the DNA from the bite wound. The profiles matched. After 23 years, investigators had a forensic connection between Lazarus and evidence from Sherry's final struggle. On June 5, 2009, Lazarus was arrested at LAPD headquarters. The arrest marked a dramatic reversal. A woman who had spent approximately 25 years as an LAPD officer was now being taken into custody as a murder suspect. Yet the prosecution still had to prove its case in court. The trial took place in Los Angeles in 2012. Prosecutors argued that Lazarus had a motive rooted in her previous relationship with John Rutan and her inability, as they characterized it, to accept his marriage to Sherry. They presented evidence concerning the relationship between Lazarus and John, including a letter Lazarus had written to John's mother. They also presented evidence concerning Lazarus's confrontation with Sherry before the murder. The prosecution then connected those circumstances to the physical evidence. The DNA from the bite wound was the central forensic link. Firearm evidence added another component. According to the case information, the ammunition used in the murder was associated with ammunition issued to LAPD officers at the time. Experts found that the markings on the bullets were consistent with a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber short-barreled firearm, similar to one Lazarus had possessed. Lazarus had owned a firearm fitting the description and later reported that it had been lost or stolen. The prosecution presented these details not as isolated proof, but as elements of a larger chain. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence, including the DNA and other circumstances. The jury nevertheless found Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder on March 8, 2012. 2 months later, on May 11, she received a sentence of 27 years to life. The conviction did not end every legal question. Lazarus appealed, raising several issues that were later considered by the California Court of Appeal, including arguments concerning the delay between the murder and prosecution, search warrants, pre-arrest questioning, and the use of DNA evidence. The appellate court upheld the conviction. With that decision, the legal system maintained the judgment that had been reached at trial. The case therefore ended not with the disappearance of every question, but with a confirmed criminal conviction supported by the evidence presented during the judicial process. Looking back at the entire story, the most striking feature is the roll of time. 26 years passed between Sherry's murder and Lazarus's conviction. For a family, that is an enormous period. Children grow older. Parents age. Lives change. Yet the moment of death does not change. Sherry remained 29 years old. Her family continued to carry the knowledge that she had been killed, while the identity of the person responsible remained unresolved. The case illustrates how a cold case can preserve the past even as everyone involved moves forward. Lazarus built a career. She became an investigator. She married another LAPD officer. She created a family life. The Rasmussen case, meanwhile, remained part of the unresolved history of the department. Then a piece of evidence collected in 1986 became decisive decades later. The DNA did not suddenly appear in 2009. It had been present all along. What changed was the ability to interpret it. That distinction is perhaps the clearest lesson of the case. Evidence can exist without immediately producing an answer. A bite wound may initially tell investigators only that a struggle occurred. Years later, the biological material associated with that wound can provide a DNA profile. A profile may initially have no database match. Years after that, investigators may identify a person whose sample can be compared with it. The investigation is therefore not always a straight line from crime to solution. Sometimes it is a series of incomplete answers that only become meaningful when combined with better technology and a willingness to reconsider old assumptions. The Rasmussen case also demonstrates the importance of separating what was known from what was later discovered. In 1986, investigators did not have the DNA match that would eventually connect Lazarus to the crime. They had a crime scene, a theory of burglary, and information about the people involved. Sherry's father had his suspicions, but suspicion was not proof. In 2009, the circumstances were different. Investigators had a female DNA profile and a specific person whose history connected her to Sherry's husband. They obtained a comparison sample and found a match. In court, prosecutors presented the DNA alongside the relationship history, confrontation, and firearm evidence. The jury then made the final determination of criminal guilt. This sequence matters because it shows how the case moved from uncertainty to evidence, and from evidence to judgment. But beyond the investigation and courtroom, the most important story remains Sherry herself. True crime can easily become focused on the offender, especially when the accused has an unusual background. Stephanie Lazarus's status as a police officer made the case extraordinary. Her arrest inside LAPD headquarters was striking. Her years within law enforcement created a powerful contrast with the crime for which she was eventually convicted. But those details should never become more important than the life that was lost. Sherry was not simply the victim in a famous cold case. She was a person with a profession, a marriage, a family, and a future. Her death left an absence that could never be filled by a verdict. What the verdict could provide was recognition that her death was a murder, recognition that the person responsible had been identified, and recognition that the case that had remained unresolved for decades had finally reached a legal conclusion. The Rasmussen case also leaves behind a difficult question about investigative responsibility. What might have happened if the possibility raised by Sherry's family had been examined more deeply? In 1986? There is no way to answer that with certainty. The available technology was different, the evidence was interpreted differently, and the investigation followed a theory that seemed plausible to those working on it. Hindsight can make the path seem obvious when it was not. But the fact remains that Sherry's father identified Lazarus as someone he believed should be investigated. And that name eventually became central to the case decades later. That is not a reason to simplify the investigation into a single mistake. It is a reason to recognize how difficult homicide investigations can become when early assumptions remain unchallenged and decisive forensic evidence is unavailable. In the end, the case was solved through persistence and the convergence of old evidence with modern forensic science. The DNA from the bite wound connected Lazarus to the struggle. The relationship evidence supplied the prosecution's theory of motive. The firearm evidence added another connection. The jury evaluated those facts and returned a guilty verdict. The appellate court later upheld that conviction. For Sherry's family, the long wait finally ended with a legal answer. But the years could not be returned. February 24th, 1986 remained the day everything changed. More than 2 decades later, the evidence finally revealed what investigators had been unable to establish at the beginning. A small biological trace, preserved from a violent struggle, survived the passage of time. It became the thread that led investigators back to a name that had been raised years earlier. And that name led to a police officer who had spent decades inside the very institution that eventually arrested her. Sherry's story, therefore, ends not with the image of her killer, but with the recognition of what her case ultimately demonstrated. Unresolved does not always mean forgotten, and silence does not always mean the absence of evidence. Sometimes the evidence is already there, waiting for the right question, the right technology, and the determination to look again. For 26 years, Sherry Rasmussen's murder remained without a courtroom answer. Eventually, it received one. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus could not restore Sherry's life, but it gave her family the certainty they had sought for decades. And in a case defined by missed possibilities and delayed justice, that certainty became the final chapter.